And this is with the new Stockfish 14 as well. So it's the first time I've run the engine. I've just downloaded it. So it's just come out in the last, I think in the last week. And in this one, it's at the Paris Blitz that was just played in late June. And it's Richard Rapport against Fabio Caruana. So we'll go to live book and in its Rapport with the white pieces. So he starts with the ready opening. Caruana goes d5, g3. So he's going in for the fianchetto. And Caruana decides to control the center with c5. So Rapport continues with fianchetto, and we get knight to f6. So Caruana is going for very strong central control. He's got the pawns developed, and Rapport is aiming for a slower setup, but a very solid one as well. So he gets in with castle, and in this case, Caruana plays e6, which is interesting because now the bishop cannot come out on the white square diagonal. So Rapport, again, playing slowly in the center, he goes with d3, and Caruana just develops naturally with nsc6. So now Rapport goes knight b to d2, and Caruana is keen to castle, so he plays bd7, developing move. And so this knight on d2 supports this e4, so Rapport gets in with e4 right away. Caruana ignores that for the time being because he has good support with this pawn and this knight, and also the queen if he needs, if it's captured, and he decides to continue development with castle. So good move here by Richard. So he plays rd1, controlling the d file, and we have queen to c7. And then we get c3, and this is, again, a slower move, but it supports, it very strongly supports d4, so now it makes it impossible for the knight to come into d4, and Caruana's, I guess, comfortable with his center so far. He has good space in the center, so he decides for a wing attack with b4, but it's a little tough to understand that one. But let's turn on the engine and see what Stockfish is saying. Right. So now we could capture, and white indeed does that, because with this rook on the e file, it makes sense to try to begin to open the file. So e takes, and Caruana decides to take with the pawn on the e file, opening again the, just a sec, sorry. Okay, so now this bishop needs to develop, so a good way to do that, he could play d4 to try to just open the center further. If captured, let's just show that. So if white were to play d4 and this were to be captured, then we would have knight takes, would be the idea. And then if knight takes here, then we recapture, white recaptures with c, and this pawn becomes a target. This knight will have a good outpost and would be able to get to e5. So if it comes back to f3 and gets to there, then it's good. But it doesn't do that, and instead plays knight to b3. So, and that clears the way for this bishop to get developed. So then we have bd6, and then white develops his last minor piece with bd3. Right. So then there's n to d7, and white has a good advantage at this point because black's position's a little strange. These pawns could potentially become weak. b5 is obviously a weakness. This is a weakness already. And so decides to play n to d7, which does support the c5 pawn that's under attack by these two pieces. So this is now becoming a main focal point. Whoops. And so, but the problem with this knight move is it was controlling the white squares in the center and now has to go backwards. So now plays knight to g5, with the idea being that he's looking to get rid of one of these bishops. So if the dark squared one captures, then it's just recapture here, reopening the file for the rook, and if not, the white squared bishop can be captured. So bishop, Caruana decides to take, Rapport recaptures, and now the rook should centralize, so RFT8 certainly makes a lot of sense. But the computer preferred queen to b6, and reinforcing this pawn, but also exhibiting control over the dark square diagonal in the center. So queen to b6 may have been better, but RFT8 certainly makes sense from a development standpoint. So here, b to e3, now that this bishop is not doing anything, he may have considered coming back. So certainly bishop to f4 makes a lot of sense, which then goes after the queen. Oops. And so instead what happens is he plays d4 and just directly challenging the c5 pawn. So in this case, Caruana pushes, but that just allows the knight to develop to a better square. So what happens here is that Rapport decides to come forward. He could have come back to d2, right, and then recycled it maybe over to f3, and then maybe look to get to e5, but Caruana now has good control over e5. So Rapport decides to not take that option, and instead allows the knight to be captured, and his pawn structure becomes slightly weakened. But the thing with this move is that the d file now becomes semi-open, and white can now, and is now, attacking the d5 pawn very effectively. So Caruana goes queen to d7 to protect it. I think in this case, like knight coming back to e7, coming back, it's not very effective here, so the knight should try to probably get to f5. So that's why the machine's recommending knight to e7 and then potentially to here. But instead, queen to d7, and now b4. So offering the en passant capture on b3, but just simply reinforcing this passed pawn. So this passed pawn could ever be taken advantage of. It will be very, very useful for white. So d4 is played, and now Rapport goes for the wing attack, so a4, and a6 to reinforce. And now Stockfish showing Rapport up by about a pawn and a half, so it's quite an interesting evaluation at this point. So the queen should get into the game and the rook should connect. So how to do that? c6 is obviously a target, right? So he plays queen to f3, overloading this knight. So Caruana now has to come up with a way to protect that, and he decides to do it with r8 to c8. The problem is that doesn't make this rook very effective. And so it does protect the knight, but the rook on this file is extremely closed, and it's not going to be so effective. So now Rapport decides to get in with a takes b5, and black recaptures. But what that does is now that the rook's off that file, now this file is opened, and obviously the rook could come into a6 at some point. So instead, Rapport decides to do h4, and he's noticing that with these pieces mostly accumulated in the center and somewhat to the queen side, that he could do a king side attack. So d3 is played. So Caruana is keen to push this, and so now it's r8 a6. So r8 a6 is played. So we're just three pieces now attacking the knight. So now h6 is played. And we'll just look at this here. If it were to be bishop to here, that again opens the e-file, and this is where the strength of the c-file really comes into being, because Rapport could capture with the rook. Let's say rook recaptures, right? And now this, not only is this bishop undefended, there are also still three pieces attacking it, and the queen is exposed. So we just simply do that. So that's why that move wouldn't work. So instead, Caruana opts for h6 to attack the bishop on g5. Bishop comes back to d2, preventing this pawn from coming forward. Certainly, Rapport does not want to block the e file, so he stays well out of that. And Caruana does eventually find knight to e7, so he wants to remove the pressure on that file. So now, with the incursion of the rook on a6, you'd want to centralize that again. So could play h5 here, and the idea of h5 would be to prevent the knight from coming to g6, but instead white plays rook to d6. So bringing the rook back into the center and gaining a tempo on the queen. So in this case, Caruana decides to get to the open file. The problem with this move is the queens come out of the center, and it's also, although it has control over the dark square diagonal, it's interrupted by this pawn, which really can't be taken. There's no good way for black to get at that, so now the queen has become somewhat ineffective. And so Rapport continues with h5, which was a mistake. So the machine likes various other options here. So you can see queen to h5 would have been preferred. Queen to e4 makes a lot of sense because it's centralizing and again hitting over here. And so h5 it was not a fan of, but it does sort of apply some extra pressure around the king, and it does get quite interesting. So then queen to e2 comes down to there, right? Queen goes to f4. So potentially preparing for, let's say, a rook lift or this g pawn coming forward. So there's a potential capture there. rc to d8 by Caruana, and that makes a lot of sense, getting the rooks into the center. Also potentially adding control to this if the pawn on d3 could ever become a passer. So b to d3. Rapport may be looking to exchange the white squared bishops. So we get r to f8, which was a blunder, right? So Caruana's getting concerned about, obviously, the pressure around his king, but to take that rook off an open file seems very dubious. And so now Rapport is not going to miss the opportunity to do this. And the idea of the bishop on f3 is it really supports g4, which he plays right away, and that is the best move. And the idea there is that this is now going to start to roll forward, break open this pawn structure, and black will have real trouble maintaining the safety around his king. And the other thing is that with this queen is very ineffective down in the corner because white still has control over d2 with the queen being very well positioned on f4. And if there's any attempt to move it, of course, knight to g6, the reason h5 ended up being good is knight to g6 cannot be played now because we would just take. And if on g5 to attack the queen, we just take en passant, the whole pawn structure is blown up. So now n to d5, and that's a good idea. So you should get the knight into the game. But the thing that allows is the capture, right? So it becomes a target on d5, allowing the capture by the bishop. So bishop recapture, and now we have a major mess. So king to h2 is played, but what Rapport should have done is realize that his queen is in an excellent position. It's not under attack. The relative king safety is nothing to worry about whatsoever because black is going to have a very difficult time attacking this, and he should have just immediately played g5 because that's just a major issue. On recapture, we have queen capture here. This h pawn can come forward, and it looks a little scary with our king exposed, but the relative safety of the kings, white has infinitely more pressure. The rook can come to here. There are all kinds of dangerous possibilities. You have r takes d8, and then the other thing too is that the rook on d8 is now overloaded as well. So doesn't do that, and instead plays king to h2, which is a blunder. So he just lost about a 5-pawn advantage by doing that. So then queen to a8. So Caruana is quickly realizing that he has to have some kind of counterattack, and the idea here is that the bishop could potentially come down here, and then queen on g2 with checkmate, if he could ever get that, if the rook lifts off e1. So queen makes sense. Get to the white squares. King to g3, and now bishop back, right? So f3 is played. So Rapport just wants to control get a bit more king safety, get a bit better pawn structure around his king, so that move certainly makes sense. And now Caruana decides to capture, right? So now both can be played, both recaptures can be played. The queen there is obviously centralizing. I can see why Rapport wanted to use certainly the c pawn. It's a passer, it's in the center, and he wants to leave the king on f4 because of the pressure it's exerting around black's king, right? So rook goes to d8, and now we have bishop to e3, and again g5 was a better option. So now queen to c6. So Caruana trying to bring the queen back into the game, and now we have bishop to c5. So Rapport is giving up on the idea of the battery hitting h6 with the bishop and queen, and instead just wants to support this passer, which has now become a valuable pawn. R to a8, getting to the open file, and now queen to e5, right? So we have queen to d5, and now there's the capture, and that takes now f4, bishop to c6, again guarding d7. So it's going to be difficult for black to break this down. And again, g5 was the right idea. f5 is played, f6 is played, just blocking that out. And king to f4, r to e8. And now Rapport probably should exchange here, but he decides not to and plays r to a1. But that leaves the open file. So black continues to go after the pawn on d6. We have rook to a2. King comes into f2. R to a7. That blocks, and now he decides to not capture and go there, and to try to go after the bishop. But now r2, r to a2 could have been played, but he comes back, and rook goes back. We have r to a7, and the rook captures it, defends it again. We have rook to a1, and the rook maneuvers continue. Now we have king going backwards, which is an interesting decision. Bishop to c6, again guarding d7. King to f2, r to d7, rook to e6. And now bishop to d5. So Caruana is going to attempt to promote this pawn. We have king up for safety, and now bishop to g2. And this could be a bit of a concern because these pawns are unguarded. So we have rook to a2, and it comes back to d5. King goes to d2. Bishop goes to f3. Again, Caruana's plan is to attack g4. R to a5. He captures. R takes b5. Bishop takes on f5. R to a5. Bishop to g4. b5. And it's going to be very difficult to with two passed pawns, it's going to be very difficult. So b takes h4, and king to e3, bishop to g4, trying to get the bishop back into the game, but now b6, these passers are incredibly strong. And then r to a7, king to e6. So this is the big blunder of the game, right? So king to e6 had to be played right away. It's going to be very difficult for the white rook to attack there, and this bishop is on the opposite car square, but instead this is a blunder. And so this allows r to a7 because the king is now pinned. He had to get the king to e6 to get off this pin, right? That allows r to a7, and now he plays king to e6, but it's one move too late. So you can take on d7, and that's it. Because if black recaptures, then we can just come forward, and then these squares cannot be got to at all. This is protected by the pawn, and that's protected by the pawn on g2. So amazing performance by Rapport. Kind of an up and down game, but very, very interesting. Very, very interesting game.